question that we as business owners think about is, what is our legacy? What does the legacy look like? What happens to you as a business owner if you were then suddenly to pass away? And this is the real nightmare that every entrepreneur faces. Okay, every day we wake up, we have to think about cash flow, we got to think about clients, we got to think about staff, we got to think about a whole bunch of different things. But there is a reality that we also are very ashamed sometimes to talk about, is that there are really other realities that could prevent us from actually prevent us to exceeding to the wealth that we were trying to help to hold up and be able to pass on to our family members as well. So when we talk about intergenerational wealth, what we're really talking about is a couple of things. First of all, we're talking about legacy building. And legacy building in the way that we're talking about business continuity, we're talking about estate planning, and more importantly, we're talking about financial security in the event that you're no longer here. Hey, well, thank you very much, first of all, to the Mydough family for allowing me to come and speak to you this evening. And thank you very much for your time. I'm truly honored. You could have obviously been doing something else, but you're thinking about a subject that is extremely important. We started our businesses primarily because we wanted to pass on a legacy to our family members. But the question now becomes, how do you start that? How do you go about trying to create that intergenerational wealth for your family members? What does that even look like? Where do you start? Who do you engage with? And these are all very important questions that none of our schools really teach us about. And unfortunately, for many of us, some of us are very much first-time generational business owners, first-generation business owners. So what that basically means is that we're trying to start and figure this thing as we go along. So just by way of my background, I've been a business owner now for over 12 years. I've been able to successfully get into a number of different sectors, such as consulting, training, into mining, and now I'm involved in technology. But one of the things that I'm really passionate about is this whole thing about how do you create a legacy for your family members, and that's what I'm going to be taking you through today. So just a bit of a disclaimer, I need to just stress that I am not a financial advisor, and I'm not here to sell any product. What I'm here to do is really to try and share my knowledge in terms of what I've done, what I know that simply does work, and then be able to share that with you. So obviously, after these sessions, I'm more than willing to kind of engage with you to see how we can help you create a legacy for yourself and for your families, and how to get that journey going for yourself so that you can ultimately make sure that you create that in a way that is actually ultimately sustainable. So the one thing that I'd like you to think about today, okay, and I'm going to ask you 3 questions. My first question to you is, how many of you will be able to access 5 million rands if your parents were to pass away? And not many of us would be. The second question is that how many of you actually know the name of your great-grandfather? And the reality is that once we bury our dead, we bury them and out of sight, out of mind. And then my last question is, how many of you will be able to pass on at least 1 million rands cash to your children if you were to pass away tomorrow? So this is the sort of thing that I want to try and provoke you in thinking. And then as we go through my presentation today, I hope that you'll be able to understand that there are possible ways. The mechanisms have been there for many years. And one of the things that you can do is to basically take action as of today. So all of us are business owners. And the reality is that running a business is a very tough space to be in. It's a very lonely space, and often we come across a whole variety of different nightmares. And these are just some of these nightmares. We're often faced with the reality of being sued with the possibility of being in financial debts. We might find ourselves in financial dispute. We may have an estate that somebody, one of our elders has passed away, and now that estate has been held up. We might find ourselves in a divorce. And now suddenly, the person that we've loved now becomes our biggest debtor or creditor. We might find ourselves in a major disability, or in fact, pass away. And then we might also find ourselves in getting involved in some sort of court cases, either against our employees or against suppliers, or sometimes even our own customers. So as a business owner, we always have a constant cloud over our head. And one of the things that we can ultimately do is try and make sure that the things that we are working for, that we ultimately protect in the long term. So what I'm going to do today is that I'm going to take you through 3 fundamental stories about how certain individuals that built up quite a lot of wealth were able to either protect it or ultimately that wealth has gone away. And I think there are some lessons to be learned for us here in South Africa, because as we've learned from some of these pioneers that have built up quite a number of wealth, it's very, very possible that that wealth can ultimately disappear within a blink of a second. So we often have heard the term intergenerational wealth. And what does that mean within the context of Africa or being here in South Africa? Well, when inheritance has to take place, what normally would happen is that an uncle or an elder in the family will be ultimately appointed to then oversee how the division of all the family assets are done to the rest of the family members. And traditionally, the way that this has been done is that this is done in the witness of family members as well as other elders in that particular community. However, the reality is that most of the time we're living in the cities and there isn't that process to take place. The roles of ancestors traditionally have guided us in terms of the way we transfer that wealth, to family members, particularly those family members that are still living here today. And often what we've often seen is that sometimes in many cases, women often are excluded too. So in actual fact, when we understand what has happened over the last 100 years in terms of inheritance laws, in 1897, when gold was first discovered, this is when we started to see the real influx of people coming from foreign countries into South Africa to try and find their prosperity. Suddenly, South Africa became the next, pioneer country to be able to kind of tap into your wealth. And over the years, what we've started to see is that we started to see a whole variety of different legislation that basically disenfranchised Black people from passing on wealth from the next generation to the next generation. So the first piece of legislation was the Black Administration Act. And basically that legislation dictated that when a family member passed away, the state then took over that piece of land, which is why today we have such a number of different cases that are sitting in our judiciary looking to be claimed as part of expropriation in terms of our legislation. After the National Party came in, we started to see a whole bunch of different legislations. And these are just a few of them that basically dictate how we now are able to pass on wealth from one generation to another. So in actual fact, what we have is a variety of sophisticated legislation, that is already in place. And after 1994, we even saw more pieces of legislation that was subsequently being introduced. So the reality is that to pass on wealth, by way of just handing it over or going to a police station and writing an affidavit, that's not possible. You actually have to go through ultimately a process. So what I'd like to take you through today is what happens within a deceased state. What happens if you were to pass away, and what are the processes that would normally take place? Now, if any of you have gone through this journey, many of you will probably say that it's actually a painful process. So let me show you what that looks like. So over the lifetime of an individual, what will happen is that you will have built up your wealth. And up until the day that you pass away, what happens is that the state will then ring fence all your assets, both in your personal name as well as in your business name, and any other assets that you might have potentially in, the name of your estate. So that ultimately gets ring fenced into an estate. And once that is then ring fenced into a state, that is then deemed to be disposed of the day before the date of your death. And then ultimately that has to be gone into a deceased estate. So ultimately, once you get that deceased estate then gets created, the state then has a fiduciary duty to then appoint an executor. So ultimately, the first person that gets paid is the executor. Now, normally what people will try and do is that they'll appoint a family member. But ultimately, it is the magistrate's court that ultimately has to appoint the executor. And in many cases, it can't be a family member. So that gets transferred into the deceased estate. The executor then gets paid, and they can get paid up to 3.5% of your total gross value of your estate before that can get then transferred to your family members. Once that's been done, then all the taxes, both in your personal name as well as in your business names, they have to get settled. You may have some debt, both in your personal capacity as well as in your business capacity. So once that gets then paid off, only afterwards do then distributions that gets made to your intended beneficiaries. And this is when Makoti gets paid. And the reality is that by the time that Makoti gets paid out, probably about 50% of the total estate has been eroded by virtue of having to pay liabilities, to liquidate positions, to basically liquidate any properties that you might have, to be able to kind of settle any debts that you might have, and to obviously pay off the executor in terms of managing that process on an ongoing basis. So the reality is that this whole process can take anything from about 2 years to 6 years unless you have your affairs in place from day one. So there are many, many stories that we can talk about. And I don't want to confine the stories just to South Africa. Even internationally, people that have died have had to have all their wealth held up in probate or in the hands of the executor. So these are just a few of the names that you probably are aware of. Michael Jackson, Whitney Houston, Bob Marley, Prince, Aretha Franklin, all passed away without necessarily having a will. And the sad reality is that this has caused a lot of distress amongst many family members. Even here at home, there are unfortunately many, many stories of instances where family members whose fathers or whose patriarch or matriarch have passed away have not been able to tap into the legacy that has ultimately then been created. Mandela Estate has taken over 10 years to have the estate ultimately, settled. And of course, Richard Maponya, the late, business mogul from Soweto, family members are now disputing the way in which that estate now gets shared up amongst family members. So ultimately, what we're trying to do here is to try and make sure that we resolve all of these problems. But even when money gets paid out, people have a funny way of just blowing it. The moment that they get money, money that they probably never worked for, they have just a tendency of blowing it. So what we want to make sure is that if you've got some plans to make sure that at least for 3 or 4 generations, that the work that you've done, the wealth that you've been able to build up gets passed on in a way that you can do that, the best way that you can do is create that in a trust. So at this juncture, what I'd like to do is that I'd like to share with you 3 stories of 3 individuals that have been able to create quite a significant amount of wealth. And ultimately, what I'm going to share with you is what has happened since then they passed away and what is going on right now. So the first story that I'd like to share with you is the story of Cornelius Vanderbilt. And Cornelius Vanderbilt, for those of you who don't know, was famous for the early part of the last century for having built the railway network in the United States. So all the way from New Orleans, from New York City to New Orleans, all the way to across San Francisco. And by the time he passed away, he had basically 13 children, had only passed on skills and knowledge to one family member, and by the time that he had then passed on that wealth to his, to his next heir, what he had amassed was the amount of about 200 billion US dollars, not rands, in total. In total. However, the reality is that most of his children did not know how to manage that wealth. Within 50 years, all of that wealth was gone, absolutely gone. So what we can learn here today is that if you do not bring your family members and teach them about the trade, teach them and expose them about what is going on in your business, what you'll ultimately lead them to have is a sense of entitlement. By the time you pass away, there are always going to be family members that are going to come out of the woodworks and feel that they're entitled to the piece of the action that you've worked for, and ultimately they will take that for themselves. And I think some of you probably have heard of some of those types of stories. So when we talk about intergenerational wealth, what we're talking about is three fundamental things. The first thing we're talking about is legacy building. And legacy building is basically creating something outside yourself. You're building wealth that's not really bringing brought towards you, but you're actually pushing wealth out so that that can be shared out with many people as well. What we're also talking about is business continuity. If you were to pass away, is there somebody, a family member or somebody in the business can take over the business and continue the legacy that you've built by creating this business? And then the third thing that we're talking about is estate planning. Who takes over the reins ultimately when you're not around? And again, a plan has to be made in this regard too. So it does take a lot of financial planning. And what we're ultimately having to do is just to make sure that, there's all the security that is ring fenced in the appropriate vehicle, so that at least when you're not going to be around, that is going to be ultimately passed on to the next generation. So the second story that I'd like to share with you is really about a really interesting character. His name is John D. Rockefeller. He was one of the early pioneers of oil oligarchs that we have in the world today. An American industrialist who was basically started Standard Oil in 1870. He controlled 90% of the world's refineries. However, by the time this guy passed away, he actually had no will. And 70% of his estate got taxed. However, the one thing that he did do was actually to have a trust in place. And by putting a trust in place, what he was able to then to do was to amass that 30% of his wealth. And today, that wealth is now amassed to about $8.4 billion, in today's terms. And what he was able to put in place was intergenerational trusts that were set up to take interest in basically philanthropy type of activities, educational type of activities, as well as business types of activities. And what we can certainly learn today is that the moment you bring in family members together, you're basically aligning yourselves in terms of what it is your family's values are in terms of being able to create general wealth. And one of the things that he insisted on is that every member of the family was to use a part of the life insurance proceeds and seed it back into the family trust. And anytime any family member passes away, the trust will ultimately acquire a family policy, a family life insurance policy for that family member, so that ultimately when that family member does die, a portion of the proceeds goes back into the family trust. And this is how the wealth has been able to get created. So what is a trust? A trust is a juristic personality. It's a personality that is an agreement between the founder and the trustees, and ultimately to serve to the benefit of beneficiaries. And what gets put into the trust is ultimately trust assets. And that can come in the form of property, businesses, cash in the banks, gold coins, bitcoins, and a whole variety of different types of assets. And the moment that gets ring fenced into that, what happens is that the founder is removing all those assets out of their personal names and putting it into a trust. And the moment that goes into a trust, ultimately, it now belongs to the trust and not necessary to the founder. And this is something that every business owner should be thinking about. So there's a whole variety of different types of trust that you can get, and I'm just going to focus on two types of trust that might actually work for you. The first type of trust is a family trust, and this is where wealth protection starts to kick in. And ultimately, you can found that trust. You can be both the trustee as well as the beneficiary, and make sure that anything that comes into the trust ultimately then goes towards the benefit of other family members too. So that can be your spouse, that can be your parents, that can be your children, as well as your great grandchildren too. So ultimately, what we're trying to do is making sure that we're ring fencing all the assets that you currently have and ultimately putting it into trust so that in the event that somebody wants to sue you, either as a director or as a business owner, at least they won't be able to attach anything that you've actually worked so hard to get. So this is something that might work very, very well for you from the perspective of protecting the wealth for your family members in the event that you're not going to be around. However, you might want to set up a business trust. Now, a business trust is very different from a family trust. A business trust is set up for wealth creation perspective. So you might be going into a whole variety of different businesses. You might have one business today and get into property. You might decide that you want to buy a yacht. You might decide that you want to go and buy a property and have that property for the next year. You may have, be in a situation where you're now in possession of land in your home, in your homestead, and now you want to make sure that the community in which you've come from is able to develop and work the land itself. So this is where business trust may be interesting. And again, you can be a beneficiary. Your family trust can be a beneficiary too, as well as some of your other family members too. So these are kind of two kind of possible trusts that might potentially work for you. And if you are at an early stage of a business, or you've got a business that's in the process of generating wealth, it might be a very good idea to have a trust in place so that in the event that somebody wants to attach something in your personal name, they can't come after you. So the consequences of not having a trust, you're going to have to, if you pass away, you're going to have very, very costly executors fees. You will have delayed distributions. You will have increased taxes. By the time you pass away, you're going to be encountering things like, donations tax. You're going to be thinking things like, estate duties tax. There's going to be a whole bunch of different types of taxes you're going to come across, and that ultimately will start to erode away the moments you want to, have that transfer to your family members. You start to lose control. If you have minors, for example, and they are now not in a position to actually take over and manage your affairs, what will happen is that the court or the state will then appoint a guardian, and everything that you work for gets liquidated and ultimately goes into a guardian fund, which ultimately is now managed by government officials. And those proceeds will then ultimately be paid in they will be responsible for paying out, to your beneficiaries or to your minor children. And vulnerabilities against creditors. Your creditors will ultimately want to be able to claim from your estate. Even if you've passed away or committed suicide, they will want to kind of have a piece of your estate too. And you may need to have family members that have special needs. You might have elderly parents or individual family members that are not able to look after themselves, and now their needs are ultimately being jeopardized. So the third and last story that I'd like to share with you today is how to do it properly. And this is the story about Henry Ford. Many of you probably have known about him. He is the inventor of the Ford Motor Company. By the time he had passed away, he had amassed the equivalent of 3% of US GDP in 1913. So what happened after his death is that he had brought together all his family members and decided that rather than controlling everything in his personal life, he was going to make sure that he was going to create a number of different trusts so that those trusts then will be able to contribute towards not only the success of the trust, the family trust, but as well as the business as well. Today, the Ford family owns 40% of the Ford Motor Company globally. And this is one of the smartest ways of being able to create that intergenerational wealth. And basically his great grandkids basically remember him for all the work that he has done. So what we can learn from this instance is that we need to try and keep the business in the family as much as we can. I know that sometimes children want to go off and do their own things, but there are many other family members that might want to do that. Transfer skills maybe to other colleagues that might want to take over that, and that way you still keep some of that wealth within the family structures itself. So what I'd like to get you to think about is what are the next steps, for you to set up some sort of family office or your family trust in this regard there. Well, the first thing that you need to consider is what type of strategy that you want to take. Do you want to take a wealth creation approach, or do you want to take a wealth protection approach? Depending on where you are, you might find yourself that you're only at the beginning of your entrepreneurial journey. So what is appropriate for you is a wealth creation approach. Whereas if you're already down the road and you've already started a business and now you've got a second business, you've got a house, you've got a life insurance possibly, well, the approach that you should be taking is a wealth protection approach, or maybe even both. The second thing you need to consider putting together is a personal balance sheet. Now, this is a very good exercise for you to start looking at what are the assets that you own, what are your liabilities, and start putting a plan in place that in the event that you do pass away, that at least you have enough money to pay off all your debts, and then at least that for your family members, it's still business as usual. Number 3, when you set up a family office, you need to make sure that you have the right resources around you. Have a lawyer or have an accountant, have somebody that at least knows about the affairs of your business, and set that up from day one. Number 4, once you start to have all of that in place, this is when you start to prepare to transfer all of your assets out of your personal name into the name of your trust. Number 5, the best way to kind of fund your trust is to get insurance. So you can actually have a number of different insurances. Your trust can take out investments. Your trust, once it's built up a considerable amount of assets, can also apply for funding and bank loans and also acquire a number of different things like properties. And number 6, get to know the regulatory environment. I can tell you now that if you have things in your personal name and the moment you pass away, this is when the state loves you the most, because this is where they'll be able to get at least 40% of your total estate and take that into the state coffers, and most of that and the rest then ultimately goes into for your family members. Number 6, have a family governance success plan in place. Okay. And usually the best thing that you can do is to have, talk about what's currently going on. Talk about that with your spouses, talk about that with your children, talk about that maybe with uncles and aunts and many family members, because you'll probably be surprised that some of your families want to actually join in the same sort of boat ride that you're on. And number 8, to make sure that you have all the support structure to have ongoing support. So I'm just going to touch on, a couple of these things, and I'm going to elaborate how this can be done. So this is the one type of structure that you obviously had. So the purpose of a family trust ultimately is to ring fence your wealth, to protect your wealth. And usually when you're protecting your wealth, these are the types of assets that you might have in your family trust. And obviously that will be speaking against your family will. And underneath that family trust, you then create a holdings company. And the purpose of the holdings company is to create your wealth. And this is where wealth creation gets made. And ultimately, underneath all of that, this is where your operating company is, the trading company. So what we're trying to do in this sort of structure here is trying to create a protective barrier between all the wealth that you've created and all the wealth that you're about to, to make. And this is one sort of strategy that you can take. The second type of approach is this one here. Now, this is a little bit more for people that are already in the process of, creating quite a considerable amount of wealth. So if you've already started a business and now you want to go into other business interests, this is where you may set up a business trust and then have a holdings company that might have 1 or 2 or 3 other operating companies. And what you're only doing in this type of structure is that you're creating a protective barrier from any creditors or any suitors that might want to come after your money. And that's where you have that ring fence against your family assets there. So when setting up your family office, you need to have a clearly defined family mission and objectives and what that currently looks like. Determine, what sort of, support structures that you might need to have. And your best friends ultimately need to be your advisors. I know that a lot of families that have family trusts and things like that will have their spouse in the trust. Quite frankly, I'm against it. I'm against it primarily because, you need to make sure that your trust is being managed by professionals. And unfortunately, many family members don't actually have the experience to manage this trust. And then what you got to then do is to kind of have all those assets prepared. And the way that you do that is you identify what those assets are. Your investments, your properties, your businesses. You may have life insurance possibles. The moment you have that, if you have a life insurance policy, you need to go and make sure that the proceeds of those payouts gets made into the trust and not into your estate. Always remember that. If you have a life insurance policy, make sure that the proceeds of the payments or the payout doesn't go to your estate, but rather goes into your trust. And that way, nothing gets taxed. And the last thing that you do need to have is that if you do have, a trust and you do have a will, is that you use the word bequeath in your will. You bequeath everything, all your trusts that are currently in your personal name, into the name of your trust and not necessarily into the name of your estate. And this is why a will is so important for you to have, so that you're making sure that everything that you work for ultimately goes to the right place. Now, when it comes to funding of your life and your trust, the best way that you can do that is get life insurance. Now, in South Africa, you can get up to 10 million rands worth of life insurance. So the way that you can use your money to create, that seed capital for your family search is that you're basically using that money to either fund for the conveyancing costs of transferring the property that you might have in your personal name into the name of the trust. Use some of those proceeds to reinvest into local interest-bearing accounts or investment portfolio. Use part of these the funding that you have to set up an educational fund. And there's many types of educationals that you can use to be able to do that. And also to use part of the proceeds to start a family bank. And those family banks can be used to assist family members in the form of a loan to start up a business that they might have there. And I would also recommend that you also have the trust then take out life insurance policies for elder members and the healthiest members of the family so that you can always replenish the monies that gets used once monies are used for family needs on an ongoing basis. So who is Legacy Builder? Well, Legacy Builder is basically a consumer educational brand. We're running a number of different workshops whereby we're going to be teaching people like yourselves about the whole area of trusts and how you can basically set up, a trust environment so that at least your family members can be taken place. And this is just one event that we recently hosted, and we will be hosting one of such event later on in this month. And we'll send you some more information about that. And basically the components of Legacy Builders is that we're hosting a whole bunch of breakfast series. We help business owners set up a trust. We're about to be able to launch a portal where you're going to be able to access information about how do you create more wealth for your family members. So you'll be able to have access to high growth coaches, you'll be able to have access to an equity investors, and on an ongoing basis, you'll be able to have information relating to trusts, as well as be able to access products such as life insurance products or financial investment products that you'll be able to have on an ongoing basis. So those are basically the components of Legacy Builders. So the culture that we're trying to create basically is an ecosystem whereby we're going to be sharing knowledge amongst like-minded people. We're creating an environment for sustained empowerment and planning, and ultimately want to eliminate the culture of entitlement within family members. So ultimately, how much does all of this cost? Now, initially, if you are going to be setting up a trust, what this will entail you to do is to draft a trust deed, and we can certainly help you with that. We will engage with you by having 2 consultative meetings We'll then engage with you by having a consultative meeting, with one of our trust administrators, and they will basically help you make sure that we're able to transfer all those assets that you have in your personal name into a trust. We'll then be able to identify what the relevant assets are. Some of those assets we may want to move now. Maybe some of those other assets will move at a later stage, primarily because, it doesn't make sense for us to do that right now. We'll help you also open up a bank account. We'll also help you register with SARS. We'll also help you identify the right insurance product so that you can see ultimately your family trust. We'll also facilitate the first trustee meeting and also give you access to an Easy Trust license, which is a trust administration platform for you to be able to manage your own trusts. Now, all of this, of course, normally would cost you about 25,000 rands. But for our clients, we will charge 12,000 rands, 12,450 rands per trust if you want us to kind of help you with this journey. Now, because you are part of the MyDough setup, we're able to make this available for even cheaper, and we're going to be making this available for 8,500 if you want us to set up your trust for you today. Now, obviously, these are our contact details. And if you want to make contact with us, please send us an email and put in the subject line, MyDough Legacy, Trust Legacy, and I'll intuitively know that we should give you then a discounted price. Now, obviously, there's going to be the cost, the ongoing cost. This is something that, quite a lot of people ask me quite often. So usually the ongoing cost for managing these costs will basically entail monthly bookkeeping. You need to have an independent trustee to advise you on tax matters. Will also help you with your with preparing for 2 trustee meetings, and nothing more than 2 trustees meetings is usually needed. We'll also help you facilitate an annual general meeting of the trust itself because it's set up like a company, and we'll also help you, prepare all the trustee resolutions to match against those trust disbursements that need to be made to those various beneficiaries. We'll also assist you with your beneficial ownership reporting, and we'll also help you submit all your tax returns and things like that. So these are basically all the services that will require you to make sure you maintain your costs. Now, typically speaking, what this can cost you is about 45,000 rands for you to do this. Now, because you're the part of the MyDough family, we're willing to do this for as little as 7,800 rands per year. So that's in effect 650 rands per trust that we will do all of these services for you ultimately on an ongoing basis. So I'd just like to basically end off with this video and encourage you to turn to one of our seminars. It's free of charge. And
imagine building stands the test of a legacy that not only financial future, but also provides unwavering protection for your loved ones. In today's world, uncertainty is the only constant. Economic downturns, government policy changes, and other unforeseen circumstances. Even the simple passage of time can pose threats to your hard-earned wealth. That's where a trust comes in. It's a powerful tool that can safeguard your assets, provide for your family, avoid unnecessary delays and costs, as well as ensure your wishes are honored long after you're gone. Join us for an exclusive event where our trust experts will demystify this complex topic. Learn how to protect and ring-fence your wealth, secure your family's future, and create a legacy that truly endures. Don't miss this opportunity to take control of your financial destiny. Book your place at MyLegacy at legacybuilder.co.za.
So thank you very much for giving me the honor of presenting this subject to you. And I think at this point now, I am going to take any questions that you might have. And if not here, then I'm actually able to have an appointment with you by just contacting us. Over to you, MT.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Israel. And thank you so much for an insightful session. As always, I think it has given a lot of us a lot to think about. And thank you so much for the generous offer to the Maido ecosystem and community. I hope it's something that we are able to take up. But I'll afford the opportunity for questions. So if you do have a question, perhaps that you'd like Israel to answer or address, please raise your hand, or you can go ahead and unmute and ask your question. If maybe you're too shy to ask your question, you can type it in the chat and we'll just read it with Israel. But I think now is the perfect time. So I don't see any hands. And I'm gonna assume that means that there are no questions.
Okay.
And that, okay, I see a hand from Vusi. Vusi, you can go ahead and unmute and ask your question.
Thank you, evening team. Thank you so much for the presentation, Mr. Noko. Yeah, man. It's a real wake up call, man. So tell me, remember, as maybe let's say I have this trust, but remember, as time goes by, currency either loses value, or maybe depending on the economy of the state of the country, maybe it then maybe gains value. So, so as you mentioned with Rockefeller about his trust at today's value, maybe which I think you mentioned 8.5 billion. Would you say from initially what he was able to put in a trust and the currency effects, the value of the amount he was able to protect increased or it decreased in value? Which one would you say, and in what aspect?
Okay, so it certainly did increase, and a good portion of the wealth that he did reinvest, what his family's trust did do was that it actually reinvested into other businesses. So today, the Rockefeller Foundation, for example, has a number of different investments across the world, and they're invested in a whole bunch of different types of different enterprises. And some of those enterprises are businesses that even own their own family members, have started themselves. So that is why, over the years, it's been able to build up. So whenever a family member wants to start a business, they can go to the family trust, they apply for money. It's almost no different from that of going to the bank. And what they're then able to do is to raise that money privately within their own family bank, start off their business, and pay back the money quite easily. So that's been a very strategic way they've done that. The other thing that they did do is that they bought life insurance for every family member. So, you can imagine that if you had, let's say, 10 family members all having 2 million rand life insurance policies, and the rule was that if somebody passes away, that at least 25% of the proceeds goes back into the trust. And then that the next generation of people, they have life policies bought out for them, and this is a way that they've been able to build that off over the years. So what you're effectively having is a waterfall effect. There's always going to be money that's coming into the trust by virtue of the fact that there's always going to be a life insurance payout. I hope that
Thank you
answers your
so
question.
much.
Yeah. So just for example, for my family members, I've bought out life insurance product for myself, and in my trust deed myself, I've actually stipulated that we will buy a life insurance policy at the age of 35 years old. And from the age of 35 years old, we will ensure that, all the premiums are then paid, so that by the time that individual passes away, at least we're able to recover that money back into the family trust. I see a question there. Is it a good idea to keep shares in the business and on the business trust or not? So the quick answer to that is you can actually either have it in a business, and I would say probably in a business first, then into a family trust. And the reasons for that is primarily that when you declare dividends at a much lower rate than if you were to declare dividends, going directly into the trust, because the trust will be taxed at 40%. So I would recommend that if you've got a business and it's in your personal name, that you create a first layer, which is a holdings company. And then on top of that, you then create a family trust. And that's where you're able to kind of declare dividends into the trust. And that money is already taxed at 28%. And then you transfer that into your family trust tax-free. I hope that answers the question for Kamal.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I think I see that she's happy with the answer. And then any other questions? If there aren't any other questions, perhaps closing remarks from yourself, Israel, before we conclude.
Yeah. Oh, there's
Okay.
Charles
I
here.
see Charles. Charles, you can go ahead.
Charles?
Charles, not sure if you can hear us, but we can't hear you. Maybe try logging out and logging back in, Charles, and then we will attend to your question.
Or
Yeah, I'm hoping Charles can hear us, or maybe type it in the chat. But yeah, Israel, maybe closing remarks from yourself. Hopefully, Charles will be able to write the question in time for us to get to it. But closing remarks from yourself, and then we'll close.
Okay, so I think my closing remarks that for every business owner today, particularly the fact that we live in such a litigious society, we're prone to be sued by anybody for whatever reasons. And most of us have worked so hard. So if you haven't got a trust today, please, please, please take the opportunity to do it whilst your business is still very much in infancy stage. Because by the time that you've got it set up, I can promise you it'd be worthwhile for you to create that legacy for the rest of your family. So do that, take action today, take action whilst it's relatively cheap to do it, because I promise you, by the time you create quite a significant company, it will be very, very difficult to transfer your wealth into that trust.
I couldn't have said it better myself. And I think on that note, on behalf of MyDough, I'd like to extend our heartfelt gratitude, Israel, for always heeding the call and running these sessions for us. We wish you nothing but the best with, the breakfast that you will be hosting. And, with this venture as well, I think it's very important work that you're doing. So on behalf of MyDough, we'd like to say thank you. I'm gonna squeeze in Charles's question because I see he was able to slot it into the chat. Is there value in having a trust for properties that you are still paying for?
Oh, yes. Oh, yes. So I want you to remember the word bequeath. If you've got properties in your personal name, it will be difficult for you to transfer those into the trust because you're going to have to pay conveyancing costs, and obviously the trust itself will incur quite high, a tax there. So what you could do, okay, is that in the event that you do pass away, in your will, you stipulate that at the time of death, that you bequeath your property into the name of the trust, okay? And that way you're able to transfer it without necessarily attracting any taxes there, because it's not going into the hands of an individual, it's going into the hands of the trust. And that the life insurance proceeds pay for the costs of making those transfers going over into the family trust. So it's absolutely worthwhile. At the same time, if you are intending of buying more properties, what I will say is that set up a property trust, and those investment properties that you intend to buy, you will then provide surety in your personal capacity to the bank, and that when you sign the title deed of the property, that the name of the trust is now the owner of the property, so that you can continue paying monthly debit orders. But ultimately, now the trust is in the name of the property is in the name of the trust. Share contact details. I'll put it into the trust and into the chat now. Israel at trustfirst.co.za. I've just put my contact details there, and then I think there's one more last question. Can you please provide us with a clear distinction between a property trust and a business trust? Okay, so the difference between a property trust is that a property trust is there for property purposes. Okay, so this is deemed to be a growth asset. Okay, so the way we treat property is very different from the way we treat a business, because ultimately what you hold in a business is shares, whereas in a property you hold a title deed. And that's the same thing not only with a house, but as well as land as well. So that's the fundamental difference. So the way that the tax regime looks at property is very, very different from the way SARS will treat a company. And the taxes are very, very differently. So that is why when you're setting up and you've got investment properties, you want to have them ring fenced into a property trust, because ultimately the income that gets generated there only attracts 20% tax. Where if it comes into another type of entity, that can attract up to 40% of tax. And that's the distinction.
All right, thank you so much, Israel. I think we are close to running out of time, so I am going to close it here. And I think once again, just thank you for running the session. To everyone that's joined, thank you so much for taking the time out of your schedule and for spending your evening with us. This session was recorded, so we will share the recording once uploaded on our platform. We'll share the link just so that in the event you'd like to go back, refer back to anything, the recording will be accessible and available. We will be back for the next workshop on the 24th of October, where we will be talking all things related to the legal implications of running a business, what are the key things and the key legalities that come with that. Just before that, we have our Connect and Thrive networking event that's taking place on the 17th of October at Deloitte at their Waterfall offices. So if you have not yet gotten a chance to purchase a ticket, the ticket is available for purchase on Quicket. I will share the link in the chat if you have not yet gotten a chance. In case you missed it, this year our headline speaker is founder and CEO of the Batu Group, Theo Baloy, who will be interviewing on the day as well. So it's something that you wouldn't want to miss. As usual, we'll have business exhibitions on the day, a lot of networking. There's a panel discussion with some pretty interesting guests from Time Bank, Candua, Loop. So please do check out our social media platforms if you have not, if maybe you have missed this information. Otherwise, for myself and the rest of the MyDo team, we wish you all a wonderful evening and an amazing weekend ahead. Thank you.
Cheers, Anne.